Jealousy is a poison that doesn't just kill the heart. It burns down the house to find a secret it can't possess. In the glass and steel canyons of the Kim Empire, the air didn't smell like success tonight. It smelled like a cold, calculated betrayal. While the high-born socialite, a woman whose bloodline was meant to secure a legacy, pointed a trembling, manicured finger and screamed for an exile, she didn't realize she was cutting the only lifeline her children had ever known. She thought she was firing a servant. She didn't realize she was declaring war on the soul of the man she called her fiancé. Because a mother isn't the woman who signs the birth certificate with a gold pen. It's the woman who stands between a child and the world's cruelty without blinking. Tonight, Kim Yang-eun, a man who commands billions but couldn't buy a single moment of peace, is about to face a truth that will shatter his ivory tower. He's about to learn that his empire isn't held together by stock options, but by the calloused, loving hands of a woman the world tried to make invisible. If this story strikes a chord in your spirit, hit that like button. Stand with those who protect the innocent. Subscribe because next week we bring you the tale of a man who lost everything to find his honor. The rain in Seattle doesn't wash away sins. It only makes the shadows heavier. On the night of March 29th, the mist clung to the Kim estate like a shroud, as if the very atmosphere was trying to suppress the storm brewing inside the master suite. Babbra Smith sat in the corner of the nursery, the soft glow of a star-shaped nightlight the only thing standing against the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and the faint, sterile smell of the billionaire's perfection. She was folding the tiny hand-stitched outfits of Emilia and Emily, 3-year-olds who were loud, brilliant, and utterly abandoned by the woman who was supposed to be their world. Babbra had no family tree to lean on, no prestigious surname to shield her. She was a survivor of a system that grinds the weak into dust, a woman who had spent 27 years being a shadow in other people's houses. She came to the Kim estate with nothing but a suitcase and a heart that had been broken too many times to fear the dark. No one had interviewed her for her soul. They only wanted someone who could change diapers and disappear when the cameras turned on. But Babbra didn't just disappear. She became the foundation. In the other room, the Ice King himself, Kim Yang-eun, sat behind a desk of ancient oak. He was a man used to ultimatums, used to crushing his enemies before they could breathe. But as the sharp, jealous voice of Claire Parker cut through the silence of the hall, Yang-eun felt a coldness no business deal could fix. The finger was pointed. The word was spoken, fired. Claire thought she was winning a battle for her man's attention. She didn't know she was about to meet the man who would burn the world down before he let his children's home walk out the front door. The Kim estate didn't breathe. It held its breath, a mausoleum of glass and polished obsidian perched high above the Puget Sound. When Babbra Smith first stepped across the threshold, the air was thin, starved of the messy, chaotic heat of a home. She carried a single scuffed suitcase and a lifetime of silence, her eyes lowered not in submission, but in the wary observation of a woman who had survived the rough edges of a world that never wanted her. She was a shadow entering a temple of ice. Yang-eun didn't look at her. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silhouette of sharp tailoring and sharper grief, his back a fortress against the two small shadows huddled on the white silk rug. Emilia and Emily. They were 3 years old, but they carried the weight of a century. Since the day the earth claimed their mother, the twins had become statues. No crying, no laughter. Just a hollow, terrifying stillness that no therapist or high-priced specialist could break. They were starving for a language that didn't exist in a billionaire's ledger. Claire Parker stood by the archway, her presence a cold perfume of entitlement. She looked at Babbra's dark skin, her simple clothes, and the way her hands moved with a restless, nurturing energy. To Claire, Babbra was a calculation, a line item to be managed. "They don't speak," Claire had warned, her voice a brittle blade. "Don't expect them to start for you." But Babbra didn't listen to the warning. She felt the pull in her gut, the ancient, visceral recognition of one orphan seeing another. She ignored the adults, the cold marble, and the suffocating pressure of the Kim legacy. She simply sat on the floor. She didn't offer a toy or a forced smile. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden bird, carved by hands that knew the value of a hard-earned piece. She began to hum. It wasn't a nursery rhyme from a book. It was a low, soulful vibration that seemed to rise from the very soil of her ancestors. It was a sound of protection, a battle cry muffled into a lullaby. The twins stirred. For the first time in 6 months the statues moved. Emilia crawled forward, her tiny hand reaching out to touch the hem of Babbra's skirt. Emily followed, her eyes wide and wet with a sudden localized thaw. The room grew unnervingly quiet. Yang-eun turned, his jaw tightening as he witnessed the impossible. "Home," Emilia whispered. The word was a gunshot in the silence of the estate. It was a single syllable that shattered the ice and rewrote the laws of the house. In that moment, Claire's face hardened into a mask of jealousy, while Yang-eun felt a shadow of a heartbeat beneath his ribs. Babbra didn't look up. She just pulled the children into the circle of her arms, knowing then that she hadn't just found a job. She had found a reason to fight. The blue light of a dozen monitors washed over Kim Jong-un's face, turning his skin into a mask of cold digital marble. It was 2 in the morning, the hour when the shadows of a man's empire come to haunt the silence. He sat in the darkened sanctuary of his study, a glass of amber liquid untouched on the desk, his eyes fixed on the grain of the nursery's feed. He was a hunter watching a miracle he didn't know how to own. On the screen, the shadows of the nursery were suddenly fractured by a ragged, visceral scream. Emily. It wasn't the cry of a child who wanted a glass of water. It was the sound of a soul being dragged back into the dark, a night terror fueled by the memory of a mother's absence that no amount of gold could fill. Yang-eun's hand tightened on the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles bleaching white. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet were leaden with the guilt of a father who knew he was a stranger to his own blood. Then the door opened. Babbra didn't turn on the overhead lights. She didn't offer the sterile comfort of a modern sedative. She moved through the darkness like a guardian from an older, fiercer world. She scooped the thrashing, sweating child into her arms, her dark skin a stark, beautiful contrast against the white Egyptian cotton. She didn't shush her. She began to sing. The sound that spilled through the speakers of the monitor hit Yang-eun like a physical blow. It was a melody that didn't belong in the high-tech corridors of Seattle. It was a spiritual, a deep, guttural vibration that carried the weight of centuries of survival, of women who had rocked babies while the world outside burned. It was a song of iron and grace. As Babbra swayed, her forehead pressed against the child's, the twins' frantic breathing began to synchronize with the rhythm of her heart. The screaming subsided into a jagged sob, then into a deep, restorative silence. On the monitor, Yang-eun watched Babbra's lips move, whispering words of a promise he had forgotten how to make. "I am here. I am the wall between you and the night." Yang-eun leaned back, the ice in his glass finally shifting with a sharp, lonely click. He looked at his hands, hands that could move markets and crush competitors, and realized they were empty. For the first time, the Ice King felt the terrifying heat of a fire he hadn't started. He wasn't just watching a nanny, he was watching the heartbeat of his house, a woman whose spirit was a fortress he was starting to realize he desperately needed to enter. In the hall, the faint click of Claire's heels approached, but for Yang-eun, the only sound that mattered was the fading echo of a song that had just saved his world. The air in the grand ballroom was a thick, cloying fog of expensive perfume and the cold, metallic scent of high-stakes ambition. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from the ceiling, casting a fractured light over the titans of the Pacific Rim. It was a world of masks, where a smile was a tactical maneuver and a handshake was a binding contract. Claire Parker moved through the throng with the practiced grace of a queen, her silk gown a shimmering armor of gold, her hand resting on Kim Jong-un's arm like a claim staked in fertile soil. She felt the eyes of the board members on them, the approval of the old guard who saw this union as the ultimate merger of two dynasties. But beneath the silk, Claire's skin was crawling with a sudden localized frost. Yang-eun was physically there, his posture a masterpiece of stoic power, but his spirit was an empty chair. He wasn't listening to the chairman of logistics discuss the expansion into the southern ports. He wasn't watching the way the light hit Claire's diamond necklace. His gaze was fixed on the far end of the hall, near the shadowed archway leading to the private gardens. There, standing in a simple dark dress that defied the opulence of the room, was Babbra. She held the twins' hands, her presence a silent, grounding force in the chaotic sea of vanity. She wasn't supposed to be part of the gala. She was the shadow meant to keep the children quiet while the adults played at empire building. But as the orchestra swelled into a soaring, hollow crescendo, Yang-eun's head turned. It wasn't the quick, dismissive glance of a master at a servant. It was the long, lingering look of a man who had finally found the North Star after a lifetime of navigating by the dark. His eyes didn't just see her. They sought her out, drawing a straight line through the crowd of millionaires and models to the woman who carried his children's peace in her palms. Claire felt the tremor in his forearm. She saw the way his jaw, usually set like granite, softened for a fraction of a second as Babbra leaned down to whisper something into Emily's ear. It was a look of raw, unvarnished recognition, the kind of look a soldier gives the medic who dragged him from the trench. In that heartbeat, the golden mask of the fiancé cracked. Claire realized that the Ice King wasn't cold at all. He was burning and the heat wasn't for her. The realization hit her like a physical blow, a visceral, jealous heat that turned her blood to vinegar. She tightened her grip on his arm, her nails digging into the fine wool of his sleeve, but Yang-eun didn't even quail. He was already gone, lost in the quiet dignity of a woman who didn't need a diamond to shine. The war hadn't just begun. Claire realized she was already losing it. The silence of the estate's sunroom was brittle. A thin sheet of ice stretched over a dark, churning current. Sunlight bled through the reinforced glass, cold and indifferent, illuminating the sharp, frantic movements of Claire Parker. She was a woman losing her grip on a spook, and the desperation had turned her blood into a serrated edge. Emilia had spilled a glass of juice, a small crimson stain on the white silk rug, but to Claire, it was a desecration of the order she could no longer command. "You clumsy, ungrateful little brat." Claire's voice didn't just break the silence, it shredded it. She reached out, her hand a golden claw of frustration and wounded pride, intended to leave a mark that would remind the child who the true mistress of the house was. The twins cowered, their small faces crumpling into the familiar, terrified masks of the abandoned. The air shifted. It wasn't a sound but a sudden, heavy presence that moved with the lethal grace of a guardian. Before Claire's palm could connect with the child's cheek, a hand intercepted it. Babbra didn't grab Claire. She simply existed in the space between the beast and the prey. Her fingers closed around Claire's wrist with the strength of iron wrapped in velvet. It was a soldier's grip, forged in the fires of a life that had never known the luxury of a retreat. "Don't," Babbra whispered. The word wasn't a plea. It was a decree. Claire's face contorted, a mask of high society rage meeting the unmovable granite of a woman who had nothing left to fear. "Take your hands off me, you insolent servant. I am the future of this family. You are nothing." With a frantic, trembling strength, Claire wrenched her arm free and swung, not at the child this time, but at the woman who dared to stand in her way. The sound of the slap echoed through the vaulted ceiling, a sharp, wet crack that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the house. Babbra's head snapped to the side, her skin blooming a violent, defiant red. But she didn't fall. She didn't even quail. She slowly turned her face back to Claire, her eyes two deep, dark wells of a prehistoric calm that made the socialite's breath hitch in her throat. "You can hit me all day, Miss Parker," Babbra said, her voice a low, guttural vibration of pure, unadulterated resolve. "But you will never touch these children again. Not while I draw breath." In the doorway, the shadow of Kim Yang-eun loomed, his presence a cold, suffocating weight that turned the room to stone. He hadn't said a word, but the look in his eyes was the death knell of a dynasty. He wasn't looking at his fiancée's tear-streaked face. He was looking at the red mark on Babbra's cheek and the way the twins clung to her skirts as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. The crack in the household didn't just widen. It became a chasm, and on one side stood the gold, while on the other stood the soul. The tension in the sunroom wasn't just thick. It was suffocating, a localized storm of pride and ancient pain. Claire Parker stood in the center of the wreckage, her finger trembling as she pointed at Babbra, her voice a serrated blade of pure, unadulterated jealousy. The red mark on Babbra's cheek was a badge of honor that Claire couldn't stand to look at, a testament to a courage she didn't possess. "You've crossed the line." Claire snapped, the words catching in her throat like shards of glass. "You think you're one of us? You're a servant and creepy. You're fired. Pack your rags and get out of my sight." Babbra stood frozen, the twins' small bodies pressed against her like shields. She didn't beg. She didn't move. She clutched the two little girls close, Emilia on her hip, Emily gripping her dress so hard her knuckles were white. Fear flickered in Babbra's eyes, the deep, instinctive terror of a woman who had been cast out 1,000 times before, but she said nothing. The twins, who moments ago had been looking for a sanctuary, now buried their faces into her, their silent tears soaking into her gray uniform. Enough, Claire. Yang-eun's voice didn't rise. It dropped, a low, guttural vibration that carried the weight of a gavel striking stone. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence a cold, controlled force that seemed to draw the very oxygen out of the room. He placed himself between them, his back a fortress for Babbra and his children. Claire laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed off the glass walls. Is this a joke, Yang-eun? Look at her. She's a nobody. Are you really choosing a maid over me? Over the legacy we're building? Yang-eun didn't look at Claire. His gaze softened as he looked over his shoulder at the children clinging to Babbra, their eyes wide and searching for a hero. They need her, he said, the words heavy with a truth no business merger could ever satisfy. Or is it you who needs her? Claire spat, her expression cracking, pain flashing beneath her manicured anger. You barely notice me anymore. It's always them, and her. What am I to you? Silence. Yang-eun didn't deny it. The lack of a lie hurt more than a blow. I see how they look at her, he said quietly, his voice a whisper of raw recognition. Like she's home. The smaller twin, Emily, peeked up from Babbra's shoulder, her tiny voice trembling like a reed in the wind. Don't send her away, please. That was the moment the earth shifted. Claire's hand lowered slowly, her rage dissolving into the heavy, cold realization that she was fighting a battle for a heart she no longer commanded. Babbra adjusted the child on her arm, her spirit ready to retreat back into the shadows she knew so well. I don't want trouble, she murmured, her eyes downcast. Yang-eun stepped closer, his decision etched in the iron of his jaw. He reached out, his hand resting briefly, firmly on Babbra's shoulder. A claim, a promise, a decree. You're not going anywhere. And just like that, the fragile balance of power in the Kim estate shattered into 1,000 rough pieces, leaving only the raw, bleeding truth. The king had chosen his queen not by blood but by fire. The rain lashed against the study windows, a rhythmic drumming that sounded like the steady beat of a funeral march. Inside, the air was cold, stripped of the manufactured warmth Claire Parker had brought into the house. She stood across from Yang-eun, her silhouette framed by the lightning that turned the Pacific sky into a ragged graveyard of gray. She wasn't crying, she was negotiating. Even now, with the wreckage of their union scattered at her feet, she was looking for a leverage point in the debris. Think of the merger, Yang-eun, she hissed, her voice a serrated edge of desperation. Think of the board. You're throwing away a decade of strategic planning for a woman who folds your laundry. You're making a mockery of the Kim name. Yang-eun sat behind his desk, his hands clasped together like a prayer made of granite. He didn't look at her. He was looking at a photograph on his desk. Not of Claire but of his daughters, their faces finally bright with a light he hadn't seen since the world went dark. In that moment the scales didn't just tip, they shattered. The Kim name is a tomb without them, he said, his voice a low, guttural vibration that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the estate. I spent years building walls to protect a legacy, only to realize I was entombing my own flesh and blood. You didn't want a family, Claire. You wanted a throne. You wanted the crown. But you despised the children who were meant to inherit it. Claire laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the thunder. Children, they're assets, Yang-eun. They're future liabilities to be managed. I was the only one willing to do the hard work of making them fit for the world. Yang-eun stood up slowly, his presence expanding until the room felt too small to contain his quiet, righteous fury. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick leather-bound folder. The prenuptial agreement, the merger contracts, the blueprints of a loveless future. With a single, deliberate motion he tore the papers in half. The sound of the paper rending was the loudest thing in the room. The contract is void, he declared, his eyes two burning coals of absolute finality. Your accounts will be settled by morning. Your things will be waiting at the gate. You have 10 minutes to leave this house before I have my security treat you as the intruder you have become. Claire's mask finally fell, revealing a hollow, freezing void. She realized then that she wasn't dealing with the Ice King anymore. She was dealing with a father who had found his pulse. She turned on her heel, her silk gown whispering a final, defeated lie against the floorboards. As the door clicked shut, Yang-eun walked to the nursery door. He didn't go in. He just leaned his forehead against the wood, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of Babbra's voice humming a song of survival to the twins. The engagement was broken, the empire was at risk. But for the first time in his life, Kim Yang-eun could finally breathe. The war for his house had been won, and the price of his freedom was a gold ring he no longer wanted to wear. The morning sun didn't bring warmth to the Kim estate. It brought a cold, digital fire. By 6 a.m., the airwaves were thick with the stench of a character assassination so precise it could only have been forged in the vindictive heart of Claire Parker. The headlines screamed across every tablet and television screen, a rough, lurid smear against Babbra's name. The beast in the nursery, they barked, weaving a web of lies about a criminal past that didn't exist, painting a portrait of a woman who had manipulated a grieving billionaire to seize a throne she hadn't earned. Babbra stood in the kitchen, the glow of the wall-mounted monitor reflecting in her eyes like the distant burning of a village. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She felt the old, familiar coldness of the refugee settle into her bones, the instinct to run before the mob gathered at the gates. She knew how this world worked. When the giants of the high-rent districts went to war, the people in the shadows were always the first to be trampled into the dirt. She looked at the stairs, her heart a leaden weight. She could hear the twins stirring, their soft, innocent murmurs a stark contrast to the venomous chatter of the news cycle. She couldn't let them see this. She couldn't let the filth of Claire's desperation touch the hem of their peace. If she stayed, the Kim name would be dragged through the mud until there was nothing left but a ruined legacy. With a trembling hand, she reached for her scuffed suitcase, the one she had never truly unpacked. She didn't take the silk dresses Yang-eun had bought her or the jewelry that felt like golden shackles. She took only the wooden bird and the single photograph of the twins she had tucked into her pocket. She was a shadow returning to the mist. A woman who knew that sometimes the ultimate act of love is to disappear. She moved through the service entrance, her footsteps silent on the damp cobblestones. The Seattle rain had turned into a thick gray fog that swallowed the estate whole. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She walked toward the iron gates, her head bowed against the wind, a solitary figure retreating into the gray expanse of a world that had always been a battlefield. But as she reached the perimeter, she felt a vibration in the ground. The low, guttural roar of an engine that didn't belong to a taxi. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat as a black SUV slid out of the fog, blocking her path with the lethal precision of a blockade. The window rolled down, revealing the granite-etched face of a man who hadn't slept, his eyes burning with a righteous, protective fury. "Where do you think you're going?" Yang-eun's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the sound of the rain. He didn't look at the suitcase. He looked at her, his gaze a command and a promise. "The war has started, Babbra. And I don't leave my soldiers behind." The Greyhound station was a purgatory of fluorescent hum and the smell of stale coffee, a place for people who were moving but had nowhere to go. Babbra sat on a plastic bench, her suitcase tucked between her feet like a discarded anchor. She watched the rain streak the grime-crusted windows, the gray light of Seattle turning her reflection into a shadow. She was ready to dissolve back into the silence of the city, to become another nameless face in the crowd, until the heavy glass doors hissed open and the atmosphere of the room shifted. Kim Yang-eun didn't belong here. He moved through the terminal like a ragged shard of obsidian, his presence a cold, magnetic force that made the travelers pull back. He didn't look at the schedules or the security. His eyes were locked on the woman in the faded coat. When he reached her, he didn't reach for her bags. He simply sat down on the cracked plastic bench beside her, his tailored suit a defiant contrast to the misery of the surroundings. "The bus doesn't leave for an hour," he said, his voice a low, guttural vibration that cut through the terminal's static. Babbra didn't look up. "If I stay, they'll tear your house down to get to me. Claire won't stop until there's nothing left but ashes." "Let it burn," Yang-eun replied, his jaw tightening with the iron resolve of a man who had finally found something worth defending. "I spent my life building a fortress out of glass and ice, Babbra. I thought power was the absence of feeling. I thought my daughters were projects to be managed. Then you walked into that mausoleum and started singing." He turned to her then, his eyes burning with a raw, unvarnished hunger, not for possession but for the peace she carried in her marrow. "I can't get enough of it. The way the air changes when you walk into a room. The way my daughters finally have a voice because you taught them that the world isn't just a series of contracts. You aren't the help, Babbra. You're the heartbeat I didn't know I'd lost. Babbra finally looked at him, her eyes wet with the shock of being seen. I'm a nobody, Yang-eun. I have no name to give you. You give me a home, he whispered, the words a rough confession that cost him every ounce of his pride. For the first time since the lights went out, I don't feel like a shadow in my own house. I feel like a man who has a reason to fight. He stood up and extended a hand, not a command but an invitation into the fire. The bus goes to nowhere, Babbra. Come back to the estate. We'll face the press, the board, and the lies together. Because a king without his heart is just a man waiting to die. Babbra looked at the scarred wooden bird in her pocket, then at the hand of the man who was willing to let his empire crumble just to hear her hum. She reached out, her fingers closing around his with the strength of a survivor who had finally found a flag to follow. The bus pulled out of the bay, empty as they walked back into the rain toward a war they were finally ready to win. The air in the private wing of the Shilla was heavy with the scent of fermented oak and the suffocating weight of 5 centuries of tradition. This was the inner sanctum, a place where the Kim lineage was weighed in silver and blood, and where the board of directors sat like a council of stone gargoyles. They were men who traded in legacies and pure-blooded alliances, their eyes cold as the winter sea off Jeju. When the heavy sliding doors groaned open, the clatter of porcelain ceased. The silence that followed was a physical blow. Kim Yang-eun didn't hesitate. He moved through the threshold with the lethal cadence of a man walking into a breach, his hand firmly entwined with Babbra's. She wore a dress of deep obsidian, her dark skin a defiant, beautiful radiance against the pale silk tapestries of the room. She was a hurricane entering a tomb. Sit, Yang-eun commanded, his voice a low, guttural vibration that made the elders stiffen in their robes. He didn't lead her to the foot of the table, he pulled out the chair directly to his right, the seat of the matriarch, the seat Claire Parker had coveted like a throne. Chairman Park, a man whose face was a roadmap of 1,000 corporate assassinations, set his chopsticks down with a sharp rhythmic click. Yang-eun, he began, his voice a dry rasp of ancient disapproval. The press is a gutter. The board is in revolt. You bring an outsider, a servant, into the circle of our ancestors? You are treading on the graves of the kings who built this house. Yang-eun leaned forward, his presence expanding until the room felt too small for his righteous heat. He looked at Babbra, then back at the Council of Dusky. The kings who built this house died of cold, he said, his jaw locked with the iron resolve of a soldier who had found his flag. You trade in names and bloodlines, but you've forgotten how to live. You call her an outsider? She is the only thing in my life that is real. He reached out, his hand covering Babbra's on the table, a public claim that resonated like a gunshot. She saved my daughters when your pure-blooded alliance ran for the hills. He gave me a pulse when I was nothing but a machine. If this table is too small for her, then it is too small for me. Babbra didn't lower her head. She looked at Chairman Park with the steady, unblinking gaze of a woman who had survived fires that would have turned his silk to ash. She didn't need to speak. Her dignity was a shield. The merger is dead, Yang-eun declared, his eyes 2 burning coals of finality. The engagement is a memory. From this night forward, this house is built on loyalty, not a ledger. If any man at this table has a problem with the woman I've chosen, stand up now and face me. No one moved. The directors looked at the Ice King, and realized the ice had turned to lava. Yang-eun picked up his glass, his gaze never leaving Babbra's. To the truth, he whispered. The inner circle had been breached, and for the first time in 500 years, the Kim family actually had a heart. The fog crawled off the sound like a gray, voracious beast, swallowing the playground in a thick, cloying shroud. It was a morning meant for umbrageous, the air heavy with the scent of damp cedar and the distant metallic tang of the harbor. Babbra pushed the swings, the rhythmic creak of the chains a steady, comforting pulse against the silence. Amelia and Emily were laughing, their small, bright voices the only warmth in the gloom, a sound Claire Parker had spent a lifetime trying to stifle. But a mile away, in a darkened sedan that smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation, the contract was being finalized. Claire didn't need a hitman. She needed an actor, a shadow with a violent history who could play the part of a consequence. She wanted Babbra broken not by a bullet but by the ultimate failure. She wanted the Ice King to see his guardian as a fraud, a woman whose love was a sieve that let his legacy slip through. Now, Claire hissed into the burner phone, her voice a serrated edge of pure, unadulterated malice. Babbra felt the shift in the atmosphere before she heard a sound. It was the instinct of a woman who had spent 27 years looking over her shoulder. A sudden, sharp prickling at the base of her spine. The fog didn't just drift, it parted. A man emerged from the gray, his movements too fast, too calculated for a casual passerby. He didn't look at the slides or the benches. He looked at the twins. Emilia, Emily, to me. Babbra's voice didn't just call. It commanded, a low, guttural roar of protection that cut through the mist. She lunged, her fingers catching the hem of Emily's coat just as the shadow reached out. The man was large, a wall of muscle and cheap leather, his eyes fixed on the children with the cold, mercenary light of a hunter who saw only a payday. He didn't speak. He simply swung a heavy arm, the blow intended to sweep Babbra aside like a piece of refuse. But Babbra didn't break. She took the hit, the impact jarring her teeth, her shoulder blooming into a violent ache. She didn't fall. She pivoted, her body a human shield between the children and the threat. She grabbed a heavy iron-weighted toy from the sand, a discarded shovel, and swung with the raw, visceral strength of a mother who had nothing left to lose. "You touch them and you don't leave this park," she whispered, her voice a sharp, dangerous vibration that made the intruder hesitate. In the distance, the low, voracious rumble of Yang-eun's SUV tore through the fog, the headlights cutting the dark like twin sabers. The sabotage had begun, the trap was sprung, but Claire had forgotten one thing. You don't threaten the cubs of a woman who has already walked through fire. The park was no longer a playground. It was a battlefield, and Babbra Smith was the only line of defense the Kim Empire had left. The rain didn't fall. It attacked, a vertical deluge that turned the streets of South Seattle into a labyrinth of gray cataracts and slick, unforgiving asphalt. Babbra ran, the twins' small hearts thumping against her ribs like trapped birds. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on pavement echoed through the narrow alleyways, the sound of the hunter closing in. Claire's mercenary wasn't just following. He was gaining, a shadow that moved with the cold, mechanical persistence of a debt collector coming for a soul. Babbra didn't look for a taxi. She didn't look for the main road. She looked for the scars of the city she knew by heart. The broken fences, the boarded-up laundromats, the places where the invisible people lived. She took a sharp left through a rusted gate, her breath coming in sharp, burning gasps that tasted of ozone and copper. She knew these streets. She had spent a lifetime navigating the cracks in the pavement, and tonight, the cracks were her only sanctuary. "Don't cry," she whispered into Emilia's ear, her voice a low, guttural vibration of pure, unadulterated resolve. "Just breathe with me. One heartbeat. One step." She crested the hill and saw it. The St. Jude Community Center, a squat brick fortress of peeling paint and flickering fluorescent light. It was a place for the forgotten, a refuge where the high society world of the Kim Empire didn't exist. She burst through the side door, the smell of damp wool and industrial floor wax hitting her like a memory of home. She didn't stop in the hall. She moved through the darkened gymnasium, her footsteps silent on the warped wood, and slid into the storage room behind the stage. She tucked the twins into a nest of old gym mats, her body a human shield between them and the door. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird, pressing it into Milo's hand. "Stay quiet. No matter what sounds you hear," she commanded, her eyes two burning coals of absolute protection. Outside the heavy iron door, the footsteps stopped. A shadow blocked the sliver of light at the threshold. The handle turned with a slow, agonizing creak, the sound of a hunter realizing the prey has run out of room. Babbra stood up, her fingers closing around a heavy brass fire extinguisher, her stance wide and lethal. She didn't pray for a miracle. She prepared for a slaughter. The door began to give. But as the iron groaned, the distance was shattered by the high, piercing wail of a siren and the blinding, strobing blue of the law. The hunter hesitated, the cold light of the street illuminating his mask of frustration. Babbra didn't relax. She just tightened her grip, her heart a drumbeat of war in the silence of the center. The chase was over, but the battle for the heart of the Kim Empire was only beginning. The sirens were a keenly screaming chorus that tore through the Pacific night, the strobing blue and red lights turning the brick walls of the community center into a flickering crime scene. Inside the storage room, The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of a hunt that had reached its end. Yang-eun moved through the threshold like a thunderhead, his silhouette a cutting shard of obsidian against the police line. He didn't look at the officers. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the floor where Barrett and a trio of security shadows had the mercenary pinned against the damp concrete. The man was a wreckage of cheap leather and spent adrenaline, his face pressed into the grit. He wasn't a soldier, he was a rat caught in a floodlight. Yang-eun knelt, his presence a cold, suffocating weight that made the room's temperature drop to zero. He didn't use a weapon. He used his eyes, two burning coals of a father's righteous fury. Who paid for the snatch? Yang-eun's voice was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to rise from the very belly of the earth. The mercenary spat blood, his eyes darting toward the exit, but there was no world left for him to run to. The blonde, he wheezed, the words a keen confession. The one in the gold dress. Parker. She said the nanny needed to look like a shadow. Said if the kids went missing, the maid would be the one the city burned. Yang-eun stood up slowly, the silence that followed more terrifying than any scream. He turned to Barrett, his jaw locked with the iron resolve of a man who was about to execute a legacy. Record it. Every word. Every cent she moved from the offshore accounts. I want the world to see the rot beneath the silk. An hour later, the Kim estate was a fortress under siege by the truth. Claire Parker stood in the grand foyer, her face a mask of high society marble that was beginning to crack. She hadn't heard the news yet. She still thought she was winning. But when the heavy oak doors swung open, it wasn't just Yang-eun who entered. It was the law, and behind them Babbra Smith, clutching the twins with the fierce, unbroken dignity of a survivor. Yang-eun tossed the digital recorder onto the marble floor. The sound of Claire's own voice, cold and homicidal, filled the vaulted ceiling. The realization hit her like a physical blow, her knees buckling as the gold armor of her status dissolved into the gray ash of a felony. The name Ashford is a closed door to you, Claire, Yang-eun declared, his voice a decree that resonated like a gunshot. You didn't just lose a husband. You lost your freedom. As the handcuffs clicked shut over her manicured wrists, Claire looked at Babbra, the nobody she had tried to erase. Babbra didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply adjusted Emily on her hip and walked toward the stairs, her back a wall of granite. The downfall was total. The queen of the high-rent district was being led away in chains, while the invisible woman finally took her place in the light. The war for the house was over. The trial of the soul had begun. The storm had retreated, leaving the Seattle night scrubbed raw and silent, the air smelling of salt and the heavy restorative scent of wet pine. Inside the Kim estate, the sterile fluorescent hum had been replaced by the warm, flickering amber of a hearth that finally knew how to burn. Babbra sat on the edge of the oversized bed in the nursery, her shadow stretching long and soft across the hand-painted stars on the ceiling. She was tired, a deep, bone-aching exhaustion that came from carrying the weight of a war she hadn't asked for, but her hands were steady as she tucked the heavy wool blankets around the twins. "Stay," Emilia whispered, her voice a fragile reed in the quiet. "I'm here," Babbra murmured, her hand resting on the child's forehead. "I'm always here." Then it happened. A sound that didn't belong to a contract or a payroll. A word that bypassed the intellect and struck straight into the marrow of the house. "Yama," Emily breathed, her eyes half closed as she drifted into the first true sleep she'd known in years. "Stay. Yama." The word hung in the air like a sacred vibration, a title forged in the fire of the community center and the frost of the park. Babbra felt her heart fracture and heal in the same heartbeat, the tears she had suppressed for 27 years finally spilling over her lashes. She didn't correct them. She didn't pull away. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to each forehead, her spirit finally finding the soil it had been searching for since she was a child in a plastic bag. In the doorway, Yang-eun stood as a silent witness, his presence a heavy, protective warmth that didn't need to be spoken. He had watched the world try to crush the woman who had saved his blood, and he had seen her rise like iron from the furnace. He walked into the room, his footsteps silent on the rug, and knelt beside the bed, not as a billionaire, but as a man who was finally ready to surrender his pride. "They aren't the only ones who need you, Babbra," he said, his voice a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't look at her as a nanny. He didn't look at her as the help. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers. A grip of two survivors who had found a reason to stop running. The nursery isn't enough. This house is too big for a somber, and I'm tired of being the king of a graveyard. Stay. Not for a salary. Not for a duty. Stay as the woman who holds my heart in her hands. He looked into her eyes, his jaw set with the absolute finality of a decree. Stay as my wife. Stay as the mother they've already chosen. Babbra looked at the twins, then at the man who was willing to rewrite the laws of his dynasty for a woman the world called a nobody. She didn't need a diamond to feel the weight of the promise. She squeezed his hand back, her soul finally coming home. The new lullaby had begun, and this time the words were forever. The Seattle air was no longer a shroud of gray. It was a crisp, exhilarating blue, the morning sun striking the glass of the Kim estate like the blade of a newly forged sword. 6 months had passed since the fires of betrayal had been extinguished, but the heat remained, a steady, pulsing warmth that radiated from the heart of the house. Today the great oak doors stood wide, not for a board of directors or a tactical merger, but for a celebration of a name that had finally earned its honor. Babbra stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her silhouette framed by the Pacific horizon. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk, the color of life rising from the forest floor. The silver fern-shaped scars on her back were hidden beneath the fabric, but she carried them like scripture, proof that she had walked through hell and emerged as iron. She wasn't presiding over a staff, she was presiding over a family. To her right, Yang-eun sat, his tailored suit unbuttoned, his presence no longer a cold fortress but a living, breathing landscape of peace. He didn't look at the guests, the allied families and former rivals who had come to witness the new era. He looked at Babbra. His gaze was a constant, silent prayer of gratitude, the look of a man who had traded an empire for a soul and realized he'd won the better half of the deal. Yama. Look. Amelia's voice rang through the vaulted ceiling, a bright, silver bell that shattered the last lingering echoes of the old silence. The twins raced across the marble, their laughter of visceral, infectious music that no diamond could buy. They didn't stop for the dignitaries or the cameras. They collided with Babbra, their small arms wrapping around her waist with the absolute certainty of belonging. Babbra reached down, her hands that had scrubbed floors and fought off beasts, now resting gently on their heads. She didn't look like a nanny. She looked like a queen who had conquered her kingdom not with a crown, but with a lullaby. Chairman Park sat at the far end of the table, his stone-etched face finally cracking into a murky of a smile. He watched as Yang-eun stood, reached out and took Babbra's hand, their fingers interlocking in a grip that would hold against any storm. The line has been crossed, Yang-eun declared, his voice a low, guttural rumble that carried to every corner of the estate. The fragile balance is gone. We are no longer a legacy of glass and ice. We are a house of blood and fire. He lifted a glass of deep red wine, his eyes locked on Babbra's. To the woman who taught us how to breathe. Babbra didn't lower her eyes. She looked at the man who had become her world and the children who had become her breath. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was the decree. The nobody from the foster system had found the only throne that mattered. As the sun set over the sound, the Kim estate finally stopped being a monument to the past and became a sanctuary for the future. The war was over. The home was won.